20 legends built the sound that raised a generation, and every single one of them paid for it, with a heartbreak the fans in the crowd never saw coming. From a motel room in LA to a frozen lake in Wisconsin, from a prison cell in Washington State to a hotel window in New York, these are the true stories hiding inside the songs still playing on your radio right now. People, you know, welcome back to R&BGROOVELore, the channel that digs past the liner notes for the real story. So if that sounds like your kind of deep dive, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and let's count down the 20 songs that broke our hearts twice.
I'm just gonna sit on the dock of the bay.
Number 20, Little Willie John, Fever.
You kiss me, fever, when you hold me tight.
Before Peggy Lee ever touched a microphone, Fever belonged to a teenager from Arkansas named Little Willie John, a voice so far ahead of its time that James Brown once said he learned everything about singing with feeling from watching him from the wings.
And fever all through the night.
By 1966, that same voice was gone from the charts. John was convicted of manslaughter after a fatal stabbing during an argument in Seattle, and he was sent to Washington State Penitentiary to serve 8 to 20 years.
You kiss me, fever, when you hold me tight.
He never made it out. On May 26, 1968, the 30-year-old was found dead in an isolation cell. His death certificate listed a heart attack, but rumors of a prison beating followed him for decades and were never fully put to rest.
Never know how much
James Brown recorded an entire tribute album in his memory, and in 1996, Little Willie John finally walked into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, 30 years too late for the man who gave soul music its very first fever.
and fever all through the night.
Number 19, Clyde McPhatter, A Lover's Question.
I'd like to know.
Elvis Presley called him an influence. Smokey Robinson called him the blueprint. Clyde McPhatter was the gospel-raised tenor who founded the Drifters and then walked away to chase a solo career that history says should have made him a legend twice over.
He's not with me.
For a while it did. A Lover's Question hit the top of the charts, and McPhatter became the first artist ever inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 2 separate times.
Pretend, is this a game?
But the hits dried up faster than anyone expected. McPhatter slid into alcoholism, moved overseas chasing one more comeback, and told a journalist near the end that he felt like he had no fans left at all.
I'd like to know when we're kissing.
On June 13, 1972, at just 39 years old, Clyde McPhatter died in his sleep in New Jersey, his heart, liver, and kidneys destroyed by the very bottle he used to drown the silence where the applause used to be.
Oh, tell me where.
Number 18, Florence Ballard, Baby Love. She had the voice that some insiders swear was the true engine of the Supremes. But when Baby Love made Motown history as a #1 hit, it was Florence Ballard standing in the back while a rising star named Diana Ross took the spotlight.
But all you do is treat me bad.
In 1967, Ballard was pushed out of the group she helped create. She sued Motown for the royalties she believed she was owed, lost in court, and watched her marriage and her home collapse within the same brutal year.
Baby love, my baby.
By the mid-70s, the woman who once sold out arenas was living on welfare in Detroit, raising 3 daughters largely alone, before finally clawing together the beginning of a comeback in 1975.
But all you do is treat me bad.
she never got to finish it. On February 22nd, 1976, Florence Ballard died of cardiac arrest at only 32 years old, and critics still call her story one of the greatest tragedies in the history of American music. Number 17. Paul Williams, The Way You Do the Things You Do. Long before David Ruffin took the spotlight, Paul Williams was the founding lead voice and the chief choreographer of The Temptations, the man who built the steps that turned Motown groups into must-see performers. Sickle cell disease and a punishing tour schedule pushed Williams into alcoholism. Doctors found dangerous liver damage in 1971 and forced him to retire from the group he had built from nothing. On August 17, 1973, Williams was found dead from a gunshot wound near a Detroit parking lot not far from Motown's own Hitsville studio, ruled a suicide, despite his own family insisting for decades that the physical evidence never added up. He was only 34 years old, and in 1989, The Temptations were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, carrying the name of a founder who never lived to see it happen. Number 16. Sylvester, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real. Sylvester turned a San Francisco drag troupe background into one of the boldest voices disco ever produced. And in 1978, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real didn't just top the dance charts, it became a permanent anthem of liberation for an entire community. He performed in makeup, kimonos, and full glamour on national television at a time when almost no other black artist dared to be that openly himself, refusing every label executive who told him to tone it down. When he was diagnosed with AIDS, Sylvester made the rare choice to go public about his illness, while the disease was still shrouded in fear and stigma, appearing at Pride events in a wheelchair near the very end. On December 16, 1988, Sylvester died from complications of AIDS in his San Francisco home at just 41 years old, leaving behind a song that still fills dance floors and pride marches to this day. Number 15. Eddie Kendricks, Just My Imagination.
But it was just my imagination.
That angelic falsetto floating over Just My Imagination belonged to Eddie Kendricks, The Temptations' voice, so delicate, it felt like it was drifting somewhere between a dream and a prayer. Kendricks left the group at the height of their fame to chase a solo career, scored a massive hit of his own with Keep On Truckin', and spent decades as one of the most recognizable falsettos in soul music. Years of heavy smoking eventually caught up with him. Kendricks was diagnosed with lung cancer in the early 90s after having part of one lung removed years before, a diagnosis he faced while still trying to perform. On October 5, 1992, Eddie Kendricks passed away from lung cancer at 46 years old, and his former bandmate Paul Williams' own tragic ending 20 years earlier still haunted him in interviews right up until his final days. Number 14. David Ruffin, My Girl. That gravel-soaked lead vocal on My Girl is the voice that took The Temptations from a solid Motown act to global superstars. David Ruffin's rasp turned a simple love song into one of the most covered records in American history. His ego and his growing cocaine habit eventually got him fired from the very group he helped make famous, and Ruffin spent the rest of his career chasing the comeback that My Girl had already given him once. Even his personal relationships carried real cost. Accounts from those close to him describe Ruffin's romance with singer Tammy Terrell as troubled and at times physically dangerous during their time together. On June 1st, 1991, David Ruffin died from complications of a cocaine overdose in Philadelphia at 50 years old, closing the book on one of the most powerful and most self-destructive voices Motown ever signed. Number 13, Al Green, Let's Stay Together. Let's Stay Together made Al Green the smoothest voice in 70s soul, a #1 hit that turned him into one of the most bankable R&B stars in the country, almost overnight. That same fame brought a darker side. In October 1974, Green's girlfriend Mary Woodson broke into his Memphis home and threw a pot of boiling grits on him while he was in the shower, leaving him with second-degree burns across his back. Woodson died by suicide in another room of the house that same night, and Green survived the attack, later saying the trauma of that night pushed him even deeper into his growing religious faith. Within 2 years, Green had become an ordained minister, walking away from secular music almost entirely to build his own church, proof that even soul music's smoothest voice was carrying real scars underneath the silk. Number 12, Roger Troutman, More Bounce to the Ounce. Roger Troutman strapped a talk box to his throat and gave funk a brand new voice. More Bounce to the Ounce became such a foundational groove that Dr. Dre and Tupac Shakur later sampled his sound to build California Love. By the late 90s, Troutman was enjoying a genuine career resurgence thanks to that very sample, proving his signature sound was just as powerful for a new generation as it had been for his own. On the morning of April 25, 1999, Roger Troutman was shot multiple times outside his recording studio in Dayton, Ohio, and police found his older brother Larry a short distance away in a car, dead from what investigators ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Authorities concluded Larry had shot Roger before turning the gun on himself, and to this day, no one has ever publicly confirmed the exact motive behind one of funk music's most shocking and most senseless losses. Number 11, Frankie Lyman, Why Do Fools Fall in Love? Frankie Lyman was only 13 years old when Why Do Fools Fall in Love made him the first true teenage superstar in American music. His soaring voice leading a group of teenagers into the record books years before boy bands even existed.
Why do birds sing so gay?
The pressure of instant fame followed him into adulthood in the worst way. Lyman developed a heroin addiction as a teenager that quietly destroyed the promising career everyone expected him to have.
They fall in love.
He attempted a comeback in 1968, working on new material and trying to prove the old magic was still there, determined to reclaim the spotlight one more time.
Can't be ashamed. I know of a
On February 27, 1968, Frankie Lyman was found dead of a heroin overdose in his grandmother's Harlem apartment, only 25 years old. A voice that once sounded like pure joy, silenced by the very industry that made him a star too soon. Number 10. Phyllis Hyman, Living All Alone. Standing 6 feet tall, with a voice built for arenas, Phyllis Hyman turned Living All Alone into a quietly devastating anthem, a song so emotionally exact that it almost predicted the isolation she was privately fighting. Behind the poised stage presence, Hyman struggled for years with depression and was later diagnosed with bipolar disorder, battling periods of substance use while trying to manage the emotional weight few people around her fully understood. On June 30th, 1995, just days before her 46th birthday, Hyman failed to show up for sound check at New York's legendary Apollo Theater, and when her assistant went to check on her, she was found unconscious in her apartment.
I'm not even the same, I'm a different.
She was pronounced dead later that day. Authorities ruled her death a suicide, and her passing helped push a long overdue conversation about mental health among performers who spend their whole careers appearing strong for an audience that never sees the cost. Number 9. Teddy Pendergrass, Turn Off the Lights. Teddy Pendergrass built an entire career on pure seduction. Turn Off the Lights turned him into the reigning sex symbol of late 70s soul, famous for concerts where he made audiences of women scream before he sang a single note. On March 18, 1982, at the absolute height of his fame, Pendergrass was involved in a devastating car accident in Philadelphia that left him paralyzed from the chest down at only 31 years old. Doctors said he would likely never perform again, but Pendergrass rebuilt his voice and his career from a wheelchair, returning to the stage and eventually performing before hundreds of thousands of people at Live Aid in 1985.
Oh, baby, come closer.
His comeback became one of the most quietly inspiring stories in soul music history, proof that the same voice that once turned off the lights for romance could still bring a stadium to its feet from a wheelchair.
You're the only one in the world that I need.
Number 8. Curtis Mayfield, People Get Ready.
There's no hiding place against the kingdoms.
People Get Ready wasn't just a hit for Curtis Mayfield. It became one of the defining anthems of the civil rights movement, a gospel-tinged call for hope that Mayfield wrote to sit right alongside the marches happening outside his studio window.
There's a train a-coming.
Mayfield spent the 70s and 80s as one of soul music's most respected songwriters and producers, shaping the sound of an entire generation from behind the scenes as much as from the microphone.
Among those who love the most.
On August 14, 1990, disaster struck during an outdoor concert in Brooklyn when a lighting rig collapsed on stage, crushing Mayfield and leaving him paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of his life. He continued to write and even record vocals lying on his back for years afterward, before passing away in 1999 from complications related to his injuries, a devastating end for a man whose own lyrics once told the world to keep hope alive.
You know there's no hiding place.
Number 7. Minnie Riperton, Lovin' You.
While we grow old, and we will.
Minnie Riperton's 5-octave range turned Lovin' You into one of the most instantly recognizable love songs ever recorded. That soaring whistle register, becoming a signature sound copied by vocalists for decades afterward.
And we will live each day in springtime.
At the peak of her career, Ripperton was diagnosed with breast cancer, and in a rare and courageous move for the era, she chose to go public with her diagnosis, becoming a national spokesperson for cancer awareness while still touring and recording.
And every day of my
She continued performing even as her health declined, determined not to let the disease erase the joy she had spent her whole career putting into the world.
please stay with me.
On July 12, 1979, Minnie Ripperton passed away from cancer at just 31 years old, leaving behind a young daughter named Maya Rudolph, who would go on to carry her mother's gift for performance into a whole new generation.
No one else can make me feel.
Number 6. Jackie Wilson, Higher and Higher. Jackie Wilson earned the nickname Mr. Excitement for a reason. Higher and Higher showcased acrobatic stage moves and vocal runs so explosive that James Brown himself studied Wilson's performances to build his own legendary stage show. On September 29, 1975, while performing that very song on a Dick Clark Oldies review in New Jersey, Wilson suffered a massive heart attack on stage and collapsed in front of a live audience mid-performance. He fell into a coma from the resulting brain damage and never fully regained consciousness, spending the final 9 years of his life in hospitals and care facilities, largely forgotten by the industry that once adored him. Jackie Wilson finally passed away on January 21, 1984, nearly a decade after that final performance. A tragic bookend for a performer whose own signature song promised his audience he would keep lifting them higher and higher. Number 5. Donny Hathaway, A Song for You.
Sung a lot of songs.
Donny Hathaway's version of A Song for You is still considered by many musicians to be one of the greatest vocal performances ever recorded. A masterclass in raw emotional control that influenced everyone from Whitney Houston to Aretha Franklin.
I've made some bad rhymes.
Behind that control, Hathaway privately battled paranoid schizophrenia for years, a struggle that repeatedly interrupted his recording sessions and forced him in and out of psychiatric care throughout the 70s.
Treated you unkindly.
On January 13, 1979, Hathaway was in New York working on new material with longtime collaborator Roberta Flack when he fell from the 15th floor window of his hotel room. His death ruled a suicide.
Listen to the melody.
He was only 33 years old, and to this day, fellow musicians still call his voice on A Song for You one of the purest expressions of pain and beauty ever captured on tape.
Sung a lot of songs.
Number 4. Tammy Terrell, Ain't No Mountain High Enough.
Down in my heart, although we are miles apart.
Paired with Marvin Gaye, Tammy Terrell's voice on Ain't No Mountain High Enough became the sound of Motown's golden era, a duet so full of chemistry that fans assumed the two singers were secretly a couple. In 1967, while performing that very duet live at Hampton University, Terrell suddenly collapsed into Gaye's arms on stage, and doctors soon delivered the devastating diagnosis of a malignant brain tumor.
From getting to you, babe, don't you know that girl?
She endured multiple surgeries over the following 3 years while trying to keep performing, even as the illness slowly took away her ability to sing and eventually to walk. On March 16, 1970, Tammy Terrell passed away at only 24 years old, and a visibly shaken Marvin Gaye later said her death changed him so deeply he considered walking away from music altogether. Number 3. Marvin Gaye, What's Going On? What's Going On wasn't supposed to happen. Motown founder Berry Gordy initially refused to release something so political, but Marvin Gaye pushed the record out anyway, and it became one of the most important protest albums in American history. Behind that visionary artistry, Gaye spent years locked in a deeply strained relationship with his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., a Pentecostal minister whose troubled marriage to Gaye's mother spilled into repeated conflict inside their shared Los Angeles home. On April 1, 1984, one day before his 45th birthday, an argument between father and son escalated inside that home, and Marvin Gaye Sr. shot his son twice with a gun Marvin had actually given him as a gift. Marvin Gaye died that same day, and his father was later convicted of voluntary manslaughter, closing one of the most heartbreaking chapters in soul music history for the man who once begged America to simply talk it out. Number 2. Otis Redding, Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay.
I'll be sitting when the evening comes.
Just days before his death, Otis Redding walked into the studio and recorded Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay, a quiet, reflective departure from his usual explosive style that hinted at an entirely new artistic direction for the King of Soul.
Come my way, so I'm just gonna say.
He would never live to see it released. On December 10, 1967, Redding's small plane crashed into the icy waters of Lake Monona while traveling to a concert in Madison, Wisconsin, killing Redding and 4 members of his backing band.
On the dock of the bay, watching.
Otis Redding was only 26 years old, and only weeks after the crash, Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay was released to the public and quickly climbed to number 1.
The ships roll in, and then
It became the first posthumous number 1 single in American chart history, a haunting final gift from a man who never got to hear his own masterpiece top the charts.
I can't do what 10 people tell me to do.
Number 1. Sam Cooke, A Change Is Gonna Come.
Know what's up there?
After facing racial discrimination while touring the segregated South, Sam Cooke wrote A Change Is Gonna Come as his direct response, turning his own pain into what would become one of the most enduring civil rights anthems in American music. Cooke was already a revolutionary figure behind the scenes, fighting to own his own master recordings and founding his own record label at a time when almost no black artist controlled their own business.
I know that a change is gonna come one day.
On the night of December 11th, 1964, Cooke was fatally shot by a motel manager in Los Angeles, following a violent and still debated encounter. His death, officially ruled a justifiable homicide, even as his family and historians have questioned the official account for decades.
But I'm afraid to die.
Sam Cooke was only 33 years old when he died, and A Change Is Gonna Come was released shortly after as one of his very final recordings, a song still sung at protests and funerals more than 60 years later, closing our countdown with the voice that changed everything.
A change gonna come.